What if the man who owned everything you'd ever worked for was standing right beside you in the mud? And you never once suspected him. He had been alive for 600 years. He had more land than most men could ride across in a week. And the one thing he wanted, the only thing power had never once been able to buy him, was a woman who would love him without knowing what he was worth. So he gave up his name and went looking. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If the man you trusted turned out to be a king in disguise, would you forgive him? Yes or no, drop it in the comments right now. I'll be reading every single one. Silver Pine Ranch, Montana, late 1800s. 1,000 acres of timber and grazing land rolling toward the Rockies, cattle by the hundreds, a main house sitting on a hill like a white church, 2 full miles above the workers' quarters, lantern lights blinking through the pines at dusk like a village, keeping its distance from everyone below it. Nobody down in those quarters had ever laid eyes on the true owner. His name was Malvern Nocturne, and it was spoken the way you'd speak the name of a courthouse or a bank. Something powerful, something you didn't look directly at. His older brother George handled everything visible. The ledgers, the hiring, the handshakes. The workers knew George well enough. But the real owner? A ghost, a signature on a deed, a rumor attached to a very large piece of land. What no one in that valley could have known was that Malvern Nocturne had been alive since before the nation itself existed. He had survived wars, droughts, 3 collapsed empires, and 1 betrayal that had come closer to ending him than any of those. 2 years earlier, his fiancée, Seraphina Blackveil, daughter of the powerful neighboring magnate Elliot Flowers, had whispered her true intentions into her father's ear. On a Tuesday night, she was certain Malvern was 3 counties away. He wasn't. Every word reached him. She wanted the land. She wanted the eternal blood. A rare compound carried in his ranch's cattle, capable of permanently ending the centuries-long craving that plagued his kind. She had never wanted the man. She wanted the inventory. Malvern said nothing. He waited 2 years, letting her believe he was still broken. And then his brother George delivered a warning, the same warning he had delivered a dozen times before, but this time with the specific exhaustion of a man who has run out of patience. A vampire king without a mate loses his soul to permanent darkness. The curse is not sentimental, Malvern, and it does not wait. So on a September morning, when the first frost had settled on the pasture grass, like powdered sugar on a church bazaar pie, left out overnight, Malvern made a decision. He would go down from the hill, not as a king, as a nobody, a day laborer named Elias Crow, with a forged letter of recommendation, worn-down boots, and the particular expression of a man who has stopped caring how he appears. He almost turned back at the camp entrance. Sawdust and cattle smell in the air, laundry strung between pine trunks, a child laughing somewhere out of sight. He stood at the edge of it all and thought, I could walk back up right now. No one would ever know I tried. Then he saw her, a young woman crossing the yard, hauling a water bucket twice her size. Brown hair held back with a piece of twine, head down, moving with the practiced speed of someone who had learned that being noticed rarely led anywhere safe. Nobody watched her go. Nobody reached to help. He would learn her name within days. Zariel Thorne, half-blood, vampire mother, human father, the most quietly despised person in Silver Pine Valley. Blamed for sins her father was falsely accused of, carrying a weight she had never once put down. because no one had ever offered to share it. The most invisible person on a ranch he owned entirely. He signed in with the overseer, a broad-chested man named Victor Slade. Voice like a boot dragged across gravel, and accepted his assignment without a word. Pre-dawn blood harvesting shift, 4 in the morning, pitch-dark barns. Victor did not know that the tired man with the forged papers and the worn-down boots was the only person in 3 counties with the legal authority to end his career on the spot. Malvern wasn't ready to do that yet, because before he could fix what was broken on this ranch, he needed to understand something that 600 years of power had never once required him to learn. What it felt like to need someone, and the answer, when it finally came, would arrive in the form of a girl with a tin canteen, a mother's old herbal recipe, and the kind of quiet, uncalculated kindness he had not encountered in 6 centuries. Stay with us, because what Malvern discovers in those dark barns will force a 600-year-old king to reckon with everything he thought he understood, and the woman nobody in this valley has ever bothered to look at twice. She is about to become the one person he cannot stop thinking about. The first week did not break his body. A 600-year-old vampire king does not break from hauling carts in the dark, or breathing the hot copper stink of a cattle barn at 4 in the morning. But his understanding of himself, that careful, centuries-old architecture of, I am just, I am fair, I manage this well. It cracked open quietly, like a hairline fracture in old china that nobody notices until the cup is already in their hand. Victor Slade ran the workers like livestock. Malvern catalogued it silently. From the corner of his eye, Victor skimming premium blood supplies and recording the difference as spoilage. Cattle smuggled out on moonless nights, while the ledger showed them present and accounted for. Food rations shorted, the winter supply order, blankets, coal, preserved goods, never placed at all, simply pocketed. He told himself he was collecting evidence. Clean word, strategic, not guilt. Then he watched a boy of maybe 17, raw-boned, quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from learning not to draw attention to need. Eat his entire day's ration in under a minute. Not because he was in a hurry, because he hadn't eaten since the morning before. The boy didn't look around afterward, didn't complain, just wiped his hands on his trousers and went back to work. I believed I was managing this place with fairness. The thought came that night, steady and damning, while the man in the next bunk coughed in his sleep. I managed it from 2 miles uphill, through ledger columns and George's clean reports. I was not fair, I was absent. Those are not the same thing. He said nothing, filed it away, kept moving. The thirst was the harder problem. It had lived at the back of his throat for 6 centuries, an ember, manageable on steady days, roaring on difficult ones. He kept a flask of herbal diluted cattle blood inside his coat. It dulled the edge, barely. On the 11th day, it stopped being barely enough. Midday, cart duty, the sun pressing down hard, and then, from the slaughter pen 50 yards east, that iron-sweet drift of fresh blood arrived without warning. It hit the back of his throat like a lit match finding kindling. His eyes went hot. He spun toward the tree line, both hands white-knuckled on the cart handle, jaw locked. Don't, not here, not now. Here. He turned. Zariel Thorne stood 2 feet away, holding out a battered tin canteen. No wariness in her posture, no flinching. Just a person extending something to another person who looked like they needed it. Herbal mix, she said. My mother's recipe. It settles things. A small pause. You looked like you were about to go somewhere the rest of you wasn't planning to follow." He almost laughed. He genuinely could not remember the last time someone had made him almost laugh. She didn't know what she was helping with. She didn't know what he was. She simply saw someone struggling and offered what she had, not because anyone was watching, not because she expected anything in return, just because. He took the canteen. Their eyes met briefly. Hers were deep brown and serious in the way that comes not from coldness, but from long practice carrying weight alone. Like a neighbor who has managed everything since her husband passed and has simply stopped expecting to be noticed for it. Something shifted in his chest, quiet, unfamiliar. After 600 years, he didn't have an immediate word for it. They began meeting Sunday mornings at Silver Blood Creek. The one morning Victor left unscheduled. 2 workers on a bank, talking the way people talk when they're lonely enough to be honest. She told him about her father, Captain Thorne. A good man, she said it with the quiet certainty of a daughter who has defended that claim for years to people who stopped listening. He had discovered irregularities in the supply records. Someone had framed him before he could report them. He was run off the land and died 2 winters later, without his name cleared. He used to say, Zariel said, turning a smooth creekstone over in her fingers, that the truth doesn't disappear just because no one's looking for it. It just waits. Malvorn sat with that for a moment. It just waits. He told her he had lost everything too. He left out the specifics. She didn't ask for them. There was a particular kindness in that. Not asking, that he hadn't encountered in a long time. Most people in his world asked because they wanted leverage. Zariel didn't ask because she understood that some things need silence before they can be spoken. He was not prepared for how much that undid him. Then Serafina arrived for the ranch inspection. She rode in as though she already owned the property, which, of course, she still believed she would. Victor lined the workers up. When Serafina reached where Malvorn stood, Victor said flatly, "Kneel." 600 years, he had not knelt for any living person. Before he could calculate a response, Zariel stepped half a step forward and said carefully, "Ma'am, he's still recovering from a heat injury. He means no disrespect." Serafina regarded Zariel the way one regards something left on the porch that needs to be disposed of. Then she slapped her. The sound cut across the yard, sharp, final, wrong in the specific way that public cruelty is wrong. Not because it surprises anyone, but because it dares anyone to object. Nobody did. Malvorn's hands closed at his sides until his palms split. His own blood dripped onto the dry dirt. He did not move. Not yet, but the decision was made in that moment, as clearly as a door closing on a choice that cannot be reopened. Serafina will answer for this. 3 nights later, the thirst came without warning, sudden and total. The way a phone rings at midnight in a quiet house. He ran for the pine forest and dropped to his knees against an old fir, shaking. Soft footsteps behind him. Zariel sat beside him without comment, pressed cloth to his hands where his own grip had torn them. She did not ask what was wrong. She stayed, not because she knew what to do, but because leaving seemed worse. "Zariel," he said. His voice was barely his. "I'm not Elias." She looked at him steadily in the moonlight. "Sleep," she said. "You're running a fever." She thought he was delirious. He was not. He almost told her everything right then. 6 centuries of it. All of it. He was so tired of holding it alone. But he stayed quiet. Some truths require the right moment. And this one, pine forest, moonlight, her sitting beside him as though it were the most ordinary thing, was close, not quite. The next morning, before first light, Madame Alain intercepted him at the kitchen door. She was already in her apron, flower on her sleeve at that hour, and she looked at him with the direct gaze of a woman who has known his secret since the beginning and has been waiting for him to catch up to it. "To that girl," she said quietly, "is the last true half-blood in this valley. Her bloodline could release you from the darkness curse. A beat. Or it could make everything worse, depending entirely on what you do next." She went back inside without waiting for a response. And what Malvorn found locked inside Victor's floorboard chest that same evening, 14 letters with Elliot Flower's broken seal, would rewrite everything Zariel had ever been told about who destroyed her family, and why. It happened on a Wednesday at noon. Victor called every worker into the main yard, which never meant anything good. He carried a wooden crate to the center of the space and set it down with the deliberate care of a man who had rehearsed this moment, unhurried, certain. He pried the lid open. Inside, 3 sealed canisters of premium eternal blood, the ranch's most valuable livestock supply, reserved exclusively for elite buyers, worth more than most workers earned in a year. "Found these," Victor announced, his voice carrying the rough satisfaction of gravel dragged under a boot. "Hidden behind the Thorn Woman's tent this morning." He let the silence build. "Theft and smuggling," he said. "Same as her father." The yard went quiet. Not stunned quiet, resigned quiet. The silence of people who have been trained, through years of small injustices left uncontested, to accept the next one without visible reaction. Zariel stood at the edge of the group. She did not flinch. Her hands were still at her sides, perfectly, deliberately still, the way they go still when a person has learned that any visible emotion will be immediately used as evidence of guilt. No one stepped forward. Victor let the moment stretch. Then, "We deal with thieves the same way we always have." Malvorn walked to the center of the yard. Not slowly, not with hesitation. 12 steps in a straight line, the walk of a man who has just remembered, down to the marrow, exactly who he is. Victor's expression stayed flat. "Back in line, laborer." Victor slayed. Malvorn's voice was quiet, the way a deep river is quiet, not still, simply too established to need noise. "You have been diverting premium blood supply shipments to Elliot Flower's private buyers for 14 months. I have the dates, the quantities, and the falsified inventory forms, signed by you." Victor's jaw tightened. The canisters in that crate were placed behind Miss Thorne's tent before the 4 o'clock shift this morning, by a man you sent while she was still at the creek. I was in the tree line. Malvorn looked at him steadily. "I watched it happen." A sound moved through the crowd, not a gasp, more the sound of a room's worth of people, collectively exhaling something they'd been holding a long time. Victor recovered. Corrupt men always do. Quickly. He grabbed the front of Malvorn's shirt. "You think a forged letter and a straight spine makes you someone? You're a nobody who—" Malvorn reached up and opened his shirt. Over his heart, in the old script that predated Montana by several centuries. The blood jade crest caught the afternoon light and held it. Amber and gold, the letters MMN interlocked in the ancient markings of his bloodline. Unmistakable to anyone in this valley who had ever studied the land deed. Victor let go. The sound from the crowd this time was different, sharper. Harlan, silver-haired. 70 years of silence behind him, exhaled one long, slow breath through his nose, like a man releasing something he'd been gripping since before he could name it. Malvorn turned to face the full yard. "I am King Malvorn Nocturne, the true owner of Silver Pine Ranch." His voice carried without effort. "Victor Slade is dismissed and will answer before the Valley Council, and Zariel Thorne is cleared of every charge against her, including every charge ever filed against her father." The boy, who had eaten too fast on his first week, looked up from the ground for the first time in weeks. Victor moved fast. Corrupt men who've run out of good options generally do. The blade came from his belt, short, close, personal. It went in under Malvorn's ribs with a sound like a key finding a lock. For the first time in 600 years, Malvorn's blood hit the ground. He went to one knee, put one hand in the dry Montana grass to steady himself, his own blood seeping between his fingers, and thought with peculiar clarity, "This is what it feels like to fall and have no certainty that someone will come." He understood something in that moment, something that no ledger or report from George had ever communicated, about what the workers had been living with, every day, on this land. Victor fled into the tree line. From 40 yards away, near the far fence, Serafina watched. Her expression was composed, satisfied, not surprised, which told Malvorn, even through the haze of blood loss, everything he needed to know. She had wanted him revealed. She had planned for this moment, which meant she had also planned for what came after it. He turned to find Zariel. She was already walking away, not running, just walking, with her spine straight and her head forward, toward the far side of the yard, her brown hair loose around her shoulders in the afternoon light. She did not look back. He stayed on one knee in the dirt and watched her go. The wound in his side registered distantly, what registered clearly, and settled into his chest with the specific, particular weight of the first cold morning in late October, when the house is quiet and the coffee is made for one, was simpler than pain. He had lied to her every day for weeks. He had looked her in the eyes and called himself someone else. He had let her trust a fiction, and the trust she had extended, careful, hard-won, not given freely to anyone, had been built on a name that didn't belong to him. He had earned this. "I've lost her," he said, quietly, to nobody, just to make the thought real. Victor's abandoned office held the rest of the answer. He found the cedar box beneath the floorboard after dark. 14 letters. Elliot Flower's personal seal broken on most of them. The ink aged but legible. He read through all of them, standing at the desk with the single lantern, not sitting down once. When he finished, he stood very still for a moment. Then he picked up the letters and walked out into the dark, toward the old oak at the far edge of the property, because he knew, with the specific, quiet certainty of a man who had been watching one person for weeks, exactly where she would be. What those 14 letters revealed about Zariel's father, about her own bloodline, and about why Elliot Flowers had engineered everything from the very beginning. That is the conversation that takes place beneath an oak tree at the edge of the property that night, and it will change the entire shape of what she thought her life had been. She was sitting against the roots of the oldest oak on the property, knees drawn up, watching Silver Blood Creek run low and silver in the fading light. Malvorn sat down a few feet away. He did not reach for her, did not begin talking immediately. He had learned, late, but he had learned, that some moments require arrival before they require explanation. She let him stay. "You lied to me," she said finally, not with anger, with the flat, precise delivery of a woman stating a fact she has already decided how to feel about. "Yes. Every day." "Yes." She picked up a stone from beside the root and turned it over slowly in her fingers. The creek moved. A pine shifted somewhere behind them in the evening wind. "You had authority over this entire ranch from the moment you arrived," she said. "You could have corrected Victor's abuses the first week. You could have cleared my father's name months ago. You had the power, and you chose not to use it." She looked at the creek. "I need to understand why." It was the most honest question anyone had put to him in a very long time. "Because I had been running this ranch from 2 miles uphill for years," he said, "trusting reports that were curated to tell me only what I wanted to hear. I believed I was governing fairly. What I was actually doing was governing comfortably, which is not the same thing at all." He paused. "I needed to understand what I had been blind to, and I couldn't do that from the hill. I had to come down and stand in it." His voice dropped slightly. "You were the reason I stayed long enough to actually see it." She didn't respond to that directly. She set the stone down. He opened the oilskin satchel from Victor's office and laid 14 letters across the flat surface of a root between them. Careful, deliberate. The way you lay out evidence that changes things permanently, and want the other person to have time with each piece of it. "Your father discovered Elliot Flower's illegal blood trade operation," Malvorn said. "He brought the evidence to my brother George, who buried it to protect the business relationship. Elliot then framed your father before he could file an independent report, planted his tools, filed the theft claim first. Your father died with a false record against him." He touched the top letter. "These are Elliot's own correspondence, dates, transactions, the framing instructions, everything." She stared at the letters without touching them. Her hands, those carefully controlled hands, trembled once, just slightly. Then she looked directly at him. "Elliot arranged your engagement to Serafina so he could access me," she said. Not a question. Putting the pieces together herself, the way she always worked, methodically, without flinching from what the answer turned out to be. "Yes, half-blood lineage from your mother's bloodline carries a compound that can permanently neutralize vampiric thirst, not manage it, eliminate it, not the eternal blood in the cattle, you. Elliot needed proximity to extract it. The marriage to Serafina was the mechanism to get him close enough." She absorbed this slowly. "So I was never just the overseer's target," she said. "I was the whole reason." "Yes." A long silence. The creek ran. The last of the daylight went thin and amber through the pines. Then she said, quietly but directly, "If I carry what you've been searching for, would you marry me for it?" The question was perfectly clear. No cruelty in it. Just the honest, protective instinct of a woman who has been used before and needs to know the exact nature of the thing in front of her before she can trust it. Malvorn reached into his coat and took out Victor's blade, the one still marked with his own blood from the yard. He held it out so she could see it clearly, then pressed the tip against his own palm. "The first afternoon you offered me that canteen," he said, "I knew what you were. I was in genuine distress, and your half-blood compound would have given me relief for years. I was desperate enough. I knew exactly what one contact with your blood would do." He held her gaze. "I did not take it because you offered it freely, as a kindness, and I would not corrupt a kindness into a taking." He cut a thin line across his palm and held it open between them, not as a threat, simply as evidence. If all I wanted was what you carry, I would have taken it weeks ago and walked away. I would not be sitting here. She looked at his open palm for a long moment. Then she cried, quietly, without theater, the way certain women cry when they have waited a very long time for a specific thing to be true and have almost stopped believing it could be. Tears that slide down without fuss, without requiring an audience, without asking for anything. I have been unwanted in this valley my entire life, she said. For what I am, for what they decided my father was. She pressed the back of her wrist to her face. And the one person in all of it who treated me as though I were worth something was giving me a borrowed name. Yes, he said. Nothing else was honest enough to add. She stood and walked back toward camp without another word. He stayed by the old oak until the sky was fully dark and the creek had gone silver black, and he sat with what he had done without excusing it. At dawn, he was on the bunkhouse steps, a cup of coffee gone completely cold beside him, watching the Montana sky move from black to indigo to the thin pale gold of early morning. He had not slept. Footsteps on the gravel. Zariel stood in front of him, holding the blood jade crest. She had found it on the yard ground where it had fallen during Victor's attack. She held it out to him. I trust the man who shook with thirst in the pine trees, she said quietly, and did not take what he could have taken. He accepted the crest. Their hands touched for just a moment as it passed between them. It was enough. What none of them had planned for was Elliot Flowers. He had slipped into the tree line during the chaos of the yard, unhurried. Like a man executing an exit he had prepared, and he did not leave alone. A rider arrived at the main house that night, horse lathered, pulling up hard in the yard. He could barely get the words level. The Legion of the Black Veil. Elliot is releasing them tonight. It was an old name, older than the ranch, older than Montana itself. Malvorn's expression shifted, not to fear, but to the grim, focused stillness of a man recalibrating everything. He thought the night was going to cost. Madame Eloine, standing at the kitchen door, pulled her apron tight and said something under her breath, in a language no one in the yard still spoke. From somewhere out in the dark, the still, windless dark, came a sound like 100 people exhaling at once. Then Elliot's voice, unhurried and carrying perfectly across the cold air. You have broken the first seal, Malvorn. The curse is not finished. A pause. It is only now beginning to move. What the Legion of the Black Veil truly was, and what Zariel would be willing to sacrifice before that night ended, is the part of this story that no one in Silver Pine Valley ever forgot. And the cost was higher than any of them had calculated. The blood moon rose on a Thursday. It came up slow and deeply red over the mountains, the kind of moon that turns the snow on the peaks the color of old roses, the kind a grandmother might have photographed with her brownie camera and labeled in careful cursive, October. Beautiful night. And it was beautiful, in the way dangerous things sometimes are, before you understand what they mean. Under a blood moon, the old landwards went thin. Boundary protections laid down over centuries lost their hold. The Legion could cross. Malvorn called everyone into the yard before dark. Workers, staff, old Harlan. He did not make a long speech. They are coming tonight. Anyone who wants to take the South Road and ride, go now, no judgment. Silence. Nobody moved. Harlan shifted his weight onto his good knee and said simply, "Where do you need me?" The attack came after midnight. The Legion of the Black Veil did not announce themselves. They arrived the way a cold front arrives, the air changing first, a pressure shift. And then suddenly the shapes were at the edge of the light, moving fast, moving quiet, Elliot directing from the far pasture, unbothered, with the bearing of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. The workers fought. They were not trained for this. They were ranch hands and kitchen staff, and one 70-year-old man with a silver-tipped fence post. And they had all simply, quietly, without discussion, decided that this was worth fighting for. Harlan worked the yard with methodical stubbornness. The blood-harvesting crew moved with iron fence stakes and lanterns. Madame Eloin held the kitchen entrance with a cast-iron skillet and something older that nobody asked about afterward, because some things are better left unexamined. Malvorn moved through it with the full force of 6 centuries. He found Elliot at the center of the south pasture. They stood facing each other, the king and the man who had spent 2 years engineering his destruction. And there was, in that moment, a strange, clarifying calm, the kind that arrives at the end of something long. Elliot raised the blade, Shadow Fang, old iron, older design, forged specifically to drain an immortal's power rather than simply wound him. It went in between the shoulder blades. Malvorn felt the cold spread outward from the wound, like frost moving across a window at 4 in the morning. Slow, thorough, the warmth retreating inward toward the center. His knees hit the grass. He pressed one palm flat against the ground and stayed there, steadying himself, and thought, with peculiar calm for a man on his knees in a field. About the first morning he had walked into the workers' camp, the laundry between the pine trunks, the child laughing somewhere out of sight. "I am glad I came down from the hill." Zariel walked out into the middle of the battle yard. She moved through the chaos without hurrying, without flinching. The way you walk through your own house in the dark because you know the floor plan by heart. She stopped at the center, arms at her sides, around her. The fighting continued. "Zariel." Malvern's voice came from the ground behind her, rough and urgent. "Shh." Just that one word, quiet, final, the way a person speaks when they have made a decision and don't need to explain it. She raised her left wrist. He understood immediately what she was about to do. He had known, since Madame Eloin explained what eternal blood could do at full release, that there was exactly one person standing in that yard who was capable of it. "Don't." She cut her wrist cleanly and opened her palm. What spread outward from her hand moved the way early morning light moves through old lace curtains, gradually, reaching every shadow in the field without force, a blood seal at full release from the last true half-blood line in the valley, where it touched the Legion's members. They stopped, not dramatically, simply stopped. The force animating them went out, quietly, like candles at the end of a long evening. Then the field was still. Then Zariel fell. Malvorn caught her before her knees touched the ground. Her face was completely at rest, not pained, not frightened, simply asleep. In the specific, profound way she had not been able to sleep in years. 7 days, Madame Eloin said, already beside them, pressing cloth to Zariel's wrist. "The bloodline protects its carrier. Stay with her, every hour." "I will," he said. He sat in the middle of the ruined field with her against his chest. The blood moon going pale above the mountains, and he did not move. He did not plan the next step or review the night's decisions or calculate what needed to happen in the morning. He simply sat with her in the quiet grass and let it be what it was. The first time in 600 years, he had stopped moving long enough to understand what he had. On the 7th day, her eyes opened. Brown, serious, still carrying the particular weight that was simply part of who she was, but rested, genuinely rested, and behind the seriousness, something newly present, something that looked like the beginning of ease. She looked up at him for a moment without speaking. Then, I want my father's name cleared in writing and posted publicly. And I want the workers' back wages corrected from the date Victor took over. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. And, she added, with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought this through during 7 days of deep sleep, I want Madame Eloin to have Sundays off. Done, he said. She closed her eyes again for just a moment, satisfied. What they built together from that October forward. And what Malvorn found written in the last page of Madame Eloin's kitchen journal is the part of the story that makes everything before it worth carrying. They married on a Saturday in late November, in the small white chapel at the edge of Silver Pine, after the first real snow had come down overnight and softened everything, fence lines, pine boughs, the corner posts of the bunkhouse where Malvorn had slept as Elias Crow. It was the kind of snow that changes the look of a place by morning so completely that when you open the door and see it, your first thought is simply, well, that's different now. 12 people witnessed the ceremony. Old Harlan, who cried and considered it no one's business, Madame Eloin, who had been in the kitchen since 4 in the morning producing a 3-layer apple cake from scratch, because she had decided that the occasion required it, and that was the end of the discussion. George Nocturne stood at the back with his arms crossed throughout, which was, for George, the sincere equivalent of applause. Zariel wore her mother's dress, sleeves altered slightly. She carried no flowers, she did not need them. She looked straight ahead at the thing she was choosing. With the same clear, direct attention she gave to everything that mattered. The minister pronounced them married in the same matter-of-fact tone he used at the general store. It was exactly right. Captain Thorne's name was cleared the week before the wedding, a formal written notice in Malvorn's own hand, signed and sealed, distributed to every landowner in the valley, and posted on the ranch board in large, legible script. It did not undo the years. Justice rarely returns what it should have protected in the first place. What it can do is correct the record, permanently and publicly, so that the lie stops being the version people repeat. Zariel stood in front of the notice for a long time the morning it went up. She placed one hand flat against the paper, said something quietly that was meant only for her father. Malvorn gave her the whole moment. The ranch changed. Slowly, the way real things change, not in dramatic gestures, but in accumulation. Wages increased, and the back pay was calculated to the month and distributed without ceremony. The winter supply orders went through in full. Harlan received 2 wool blankets and, some weeks later, a good rocking chair that appeared outside his door with no note. He did not ask where it came from. Some gifts are better accepted without paperwork. Madame Eloin hired 2 kitchen assistants and began a Friday evening cooking class that half the ranch showed up for, officially for the food, genuinely for the company, because loneliness and hunger are related in ways that go beyond the stomach. Victor answered before the Valley Council. Elliot Flowers and Seraphina, with 14 letters as evidence and Victor's complete cooperation once silence stopped serving him, were brought before the appropriate authorities and dealt with according to what the record clearly showed. It was slow, it was documented, it held. The valley did not become a paradise, but it became fairer, more honest, the kind of community where when old, Harlan dropped his walking stick outside the supply store. 3 hands reached for it simultaneously, and nobody made an occasion of it. That is something. It is, in fact, a great deal. Their son arrived the following October. The same season the blood seal had saved the ranch, as though the year was completing a kind of symmetry. Silver gray eyes, his father's, brown hair, his mother's, loud, unhesitating, deeply skeptical of the kitchen cat from his first week of awareness. One evening, when the boy had been asleep in his cradle and Malvern had come in from the porch, he found Zariel in the kitchen in a quiet standoff with a flour-dusted recipe card. She was frowning at it, the particular, concentrated frown of a woman who has invested real effort into something that is not cooperating, and she blew a strand of hair off her face, which sent a small cloud of flour in a different direction. She blew again. The flour ignored her. Malvern stood in the doorway and watched this for a moment, and felt, specifically, quietly, more content than he had been in 600 years. Not the formal satisfaction of accomplishment, the small, warm, Tuesday evening contentment of watching the person you love lose a minor argument with a recipe card. Then a small sound came from the cradle. He crossed to it. The boy's eyes were open, those silver-gray eyes, too steady and attentive for his age, watching things with a focus that made Madame Eloin say every visit, "That child sees something the rest of us don't." The boy reached up and wrapped one hand around Malvern's finger. Then, in a voice entirely too clear for his age, "Father, the darkness is calling." The fire in the hearth dropped for a single beat, just once, the way a candle responds to something passing nearby. Outside, a wind rose, not the ordinary November wind that rattled glass and moved branches. Something with direction, something that had been traveling toward this specific house for a long time. Malvern looked at his son, then at the window, then at Zariel, who had set down the recipe card and was watching him from the kitchen doorway with those steady, serious eyes. He crossed to her. He took her hand and held it, the flower still on her sleeve, the recipe card still on the counter between them, their son quiet in the cradle behind him. "I will find the source of this," he said, "whatever it takes." Zariel turned his hand over and touched the blood jade crest on his wrist, lightly, with one finger, the way you touch something you have decided to trust. "Then we go together," she said. Simply, the way she said everything that mattered. He had stood on that hill for 600 years. He would have stood there forever. This man with every advantage and no one who knew him. This king armored in power and hollowed out by centuries of careful distance. If a young woman with a tin canteen and a mother's recipe and a heart too generous for the world that had treated her hadn't crossed a dusty yard in the midday sun without expecting a single thing in return, kindness doesn't announce itself. That's the whole truth of it. It shows up quietly, when someone looks like they're about to fall over, and offers what it has, not for an audience, not for a return, just because. And sometimes, if you are willing to come down from your hill and be known, truly, imperfectly known, it changes everything. This story reminds us that the loneliest people are not always those who have nothing. Sometimes they are the ones who have everything, except someone willing to see past all of it and stay anyway. It reminds us that the people our world overlooks, those called difficult or tainted or too much trouble, are often the ones carrying the greatest light, and that the light, if we are paying attention, has always been there, waiting. And it reminds us it is never too late to come down from the hill, even if you've been standing up there for 600 years. Even if it's only a Tuesday morning and the coffee is cold, you can still set 2 cups out. This vampire tale was born from a real human soul, full of emotion, contradiction, and longing. AI was merely a companion who helped arrange the words to be as beautiful and clear as possible. That's why you'll find it not only terrifying, but also very human.